You take your soul's light into that tunnel and hold his soul's light up so it will be there when he needs it at the end of this particular journey.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lori Stevick Rust. 40 years of sitting with people through their hardest moments has taught me one thing. Our power lives in our courage to be real. This is where we stop pretending and we find our way back to ourselves. I'm glad you're here. Now pull up a chair. This is Becoming Real. Right now, more than 57 million people worldwide are living with dementia. Nearly 10 million new cases every single year. And behind every single one of those cases and those diagnoses, there's a caregiver. In the United States alone, nearly 12 million people are doing that work, often unpaid, unseen, and often alone. I know this world. I've spent close to 40 years as a clinical health psychologist, walking alongside families who are navigating this path. And I've walked it personally in providing care and support for my father with dementia. And here's what I know to be true. Caregiving is not tidy. It's messy, it's exhausting, it's loving, and often lonely. It asks you to show up on days when you have nothing left. It asks you to show up and hold on to love while you're losing the pieces of the person that you love. And here's what else I know. Caregiving for dementia is both an honor and a heartbreak. And though the path is hard, you do not have to walk it alone. Today's guest has lived that truth, and she's here to share with us some honest, truthful conversations about that journey. And this conversation is for every caregiver who's listening, who needs to hear that someone understands. Welcome to Becoming Real. Well, I am so excited and thrilled to be here with our guest today, Dr. Melodie Yates. And we're going to talk a lot about, well, really important emotional caregiving conversations. But before that, let me tell you that this is a woman of many other skills. A university administrator who turned author, Dr. Melodie Yates, spent the last 16 years caring for her husband of 50 years as he and they together went down the path of Alzheimer's disease. And she wrote poems as a release and as a way to cope, naming and claiming her frustration and emotions as they came to her. Her related credentials, which I love, are flexibility, love, perseverance, and desperation, all rolled into one. Surrounded by many friends and a supportive blended family of 5 children and 3 grandchildren, Melodie wrote her first book called Love is an Action Verb. And we're going to get down to talking a little bit about her book as well. But first and foremost, thank you so much, Melodie, for being here. I am delighted and excited because I know this is a important journey. And for so many of our listeners, when they hear the word caregiver, by its very token, we think of it as the act of providing care. And how hard can that be? And it comes from a place of love until you sit down with people who have been doing this journey of caring for somebody with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. It's a very different path. So I thought for our listeners today, we really need to get into talking about all of these issues through the lens of what it feels like to be the caregiver and not just the tasks and things we have to do for the person that we love. Oftentimes, caregivers will say that maybe the onset of recognizing changes or deficits in their loved one was sort of insidious. Like they knew something wasn't quite right, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And for other people, it feels like it just came from the blind side. So would you tell us a little bit, first of all, about your husband, who you provided care for of 50 years? And then when you first noticed, and I mean not when somebody else pointed it out or when a diagnosis came, but when something in your gut said, something is different or something is off with my husband.
Well, first, let me say thank you for inviting me to be here today. I think that for me, my husband was a very accomplished man. He had a PhD in counseling psychology. He was the director of the counseling center at Cleveland State. And he was very aware himself that something was not quite right. And so he took, unknown to me, he took himself to a neurologist for testing, both physical and, if there was something else going on. And when then the results of the tests were going to come in, he invited me to attend. And that was the first that I had known he was doing anything. In terms of before that, I was noticing he was never, we used to joke about how badly he could keep a calendar because he would double book, he would do those things. But that was happening more and more and more. Or we would agree to meet somewhere before we left campus together. And he would go one place and I'd go another place where I'm thinking that that's where we're supposed to meet. So there were little things like that, but I wasn't really tracking them as warning signs at that point. So fast forward to this doctor's appointment, and the diagnosis that the neurologist delivered was one of mild cognitive dysfunction. And he talked also a little bit about how oftentimes this is a precursor to a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. But right now, he had it at the mild cognitive dysfunction level. So we took that home and talked a little bit about what that might mean, but not a lot. And then somewhere between that diagnosis and maybe the year and a half after that, where he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I remember we were standing in the kitchen talking about something, trying to decide some item. I don't know. The content of it, I don't remember. What I do remember is that the conversation was weird. I would say something, he'd say something back that wasn't really at all on topic, or the reasoning behind what he was saying was kind of missing the mark. It was not a typical conversation at all. We had throughout our marriage been very, very consultative in our decision making and all of that. So we were very used to having conversations like this, but it just wasn't right. And about halfway through, it hit me that I was losing my partner, that the our ways of being together were about to forever change. And the impact of that was frightening. I felt hollowed out and not certain where to turn, really, or how. It wasn't something I could say, "Oh, by the way, I think I'm losing you." We couldn't have that kind of a conversation. So it was the first real marker of recognizing that the future held a lot of observations and feelings and, behaviors that I wouldn't be able to share. And that for me was kind of the marker of the beginning of the shift.
The fact that this many years later, you can reflect back to that moment in the kitchen, I think many caregivers can relate to the moment that said, "My life has just changed." And so I'm interested because when you tell the story, I tell myself a story about two loving, connected people, two intellectuals having these conversations, collaborating, life's decisions, and life's sorrows. Like you guys turn to each other. And in that moment, I'm just wondering inside of you, this was big and heavy. Where did you turn because the person you would normally be turning to was not present for you?
Well, initially, I didn't turn to anybody. I just am a person who tends to process things out loud rather than internally. But in this instance, I just kept it to myself and didn't call up a friend and say, "You're not going to believe what just happened," any of that. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I know that in the beginnings of this journey, I felt protective of him the entire time, but I felt particularly protective of him in terms of not really wanting to tell anybody that something was wrong. And when the diagnosis of Alzheimer happened, then we the whole family, including, some extended parts of it, were all together for one of our son's college graduation. And so, since everybody was there, then we told them about the Alzheimer's diagnosis and, you know, asked everybody for their support and that kind of thing, and told them that we were telling them now at the beginning because we this is a journey that we were gonna go through together as a family, and that we didn't want to have surprises and secrets along the way, so that we would be talking to them about, you know, what's happening. Beyond that, though, even for a while anyway, even my and our close friends, we didn't tell. And I know the reason for me is because when somebody says so and so has Alzheimer's, there's a certain image of somebody wandering around, not knowing where they are, not recognizing anybody, just really picturing somebody with a very diminished capacity. And because his diagnosis was so early, he didn't have, I mean, there were issues for sure, but he could kind of get over, you know, if you had a conversation with him in the early years, you might not notice that there were things off. People who knew him said something's not right. But so initially, I didn't tell people. And then, after a year or so, then I began to share a little bit more. And we talked about it. And there were people that he did not want them to know. And then there were other people that, so we slowly expanded our circle of loving support.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting and I think almost universal issue, so much so that I wrote about it in my book because it is a true battle of how do I maintain the dignity of somebody I love, hold information internal to protect his dignity or her dignity, and at the same time trying to figure out what does that do then to you? Because I'm often struck by if somebody has a cancer diagnosis or another chronic illness, while there might be moments that families will hold tight until they can get their footing underneath them, but it doesn't have that same level of preserving
Mhm.
dignity in the way that a loved one with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, that we feel like we have to protect them. And that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. I think it's our natural intuition, but it also has the risk, I think, of keeping us isolated in
Mhm.
how do we get our support if we don't tell our story? And I don't think there's a right or a wrong, but it's an interesting struggle that I hear a lot from caregivers. And you bringing that up, I think, reminded me of some of those stories.
Yeah, and I think, and I hear stories like that too, and am sometimes surprised that, parents don't talk to their children about it, or they, and on one level, I kind of get that, but that's a really heavy burden to carry by yourself.
Mhm.
And we together and me separately didn't have to do that for very long. And probably I couldn't have, I mean, at some point it would have. I think one of Dick's favorite sayings, he would say there's more room out than in. And I think that had I not begun to share with other people, then there probably would have been, some explosions along the way for all that pent up energy and emotion and all of that, which is not facilitative to the caregiving process,
Right.
at all. So I did lean on people. I leaned on our kids. I leaned, you know, And that's a whole another kind of thing because on the one hand, you want to be you want to be honest, want them to experience a little bit along the way because again, the surprises are, well, how did he get like that? Or, you know, and yet, all these years, the feedback, that I've gotten is, well, why didn't you tell us about that? Why didn't you tell us about this? You know, and and so finding that balance, I don't know if I ever found the exact like, sometimes was I sharing too much? Do they really want to hear about, X, Y, or Z? If I were to fast forward to, the after COVID, because during COVID, it was just him and me, and the kids could come and visit. What I was struck by was seeing myself in their eyes. And it wasn't a good look, it was not a good look. And I wasn't able until that moment to see just how badly I had disappeared in this process. And I know we're talking about the beginnings, but something about what we're talking about put me, in the end. So there's a whole lot that happened in between, but the what do you tell and who do you tell is hard. And some people have no one to tell. And I don't know how they survive.
Yeah, I think that is the biggest takeaway, right? And that's, I think, why we're having these conversations, why we have support programs, why there are organizations, why there are books that, you know, and I hear this a lot, and I've heard many people say, you can't do this alone. It is a team. And sometimes the team is your family, and sometimes it's the community, and sometimes it's a combination of all of that. So yes, we're talking about the beginning, but there's a reason we call it a journey, because one thing morphs into the next thing oftentimes, and it's some things take a twist and turn and some things become more exacerbated. And it strikes me through that journey, which is another component of what you're talking about. There's the boundaries of, like, as a parent, am I supposed to be protecting my kids from knowing the details of what's really happening with their dad? Or am I supposed to be revealing embarrassing things about their dad as a way to give them a benchmark for how far things are changing?
Mhm.
Or do I need to keep that private? And if I keep that private, who could I share those kinds of things with, or am I destined to carry it alone? I don't I don't have an easy answer unless you do, but I think it is a conversation worth having out loud with caregivers so they know that this internal kind of pulling inward is an okay thing for the moment to get your footing again underneath you, but you can't stay there. It's a lonely place to completely be turned inward.
Yeah. It's not healthy either.
Right.
Um, and I mean, so, the sort of the family joke has been for a long time, even before this happened, so you all have good jobs, you can pay for your own therapy. You know, we've we've we did the best that we could and hoped that that was at least, foundational enough to have you be okay.
Mhm.
And I think that kind of goes for this situation too. I shared as best I could. And I think the other aspect of it is, one of the poems I wrote had to do about fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine,
Right.
which is, the socially acceptable response to I'm really hanging by the thread, the thread, but I really can't tell you all of it. So I'm just going to say I'm fine. And I certainly was guilty of doing that with the kids sometimes. And then on the other hand, sometimes I probably shared too much. But yet, you just do the best
Mhm.
that you can do
Yeah, and
and hope that's okay.
exactly, and I think that's an interesting perspective about even I'm fine, because I hear this a lot. And actually, somebody in one of my support programs, the support group, actually made that comment of sometimes she says, I'm fine because she's not ready for a dementia conversation,
Mhm.
that she's looking for an escape and wants to talk about something completely different. And other times says, I'm fine because the true answer would be, do you really want to know that my loved one took his clothes off and walked outside? Do you really want to know that my wife did X, Y, and Z? Or is that going to be a hard thing for you to hear? Then you're uncomfortable. Then I got to figure out how to make you feel better. So fine seems like the easiest, quickest answer to give, even when it's not the healthiest answer.
Yeah. Every day is a choice of one sort or another. Yeah. There are resources. I think, your book does a really good job, I think, of helping people think about those things. And I would highly recommend that if you can't do anything else, find a caregivers group.
Mhm.
One of the really sweet things that one of my daughters-in-law did early on is she kept trying to get me to go, to a support group. And I kept thinking, "Oh, this is a good thing," but, feeling a little bit like, "Well, what do I talk about? I don't know, these are straight," all that stuff. And so one time they were visiting, she says, "Come on, I found one, we're going." And so she took me to this group. It was fine. It was interesting, I could sort of see myself there. But what was, I think, the most beautiful part of the experience was her getting me in a car. And, the poor thing had been saying, "You gotta go, you gotta," and I'm like, "Okay, okay."
You knew that
And then I found one through the Alzheimer's Association that had a group going on for Dick while I was in another group. And that was good because then I didn't have to worry about him, and when it was kinda educational, and that was good. And then he refused to go anymore, so and then we were actually going to visit somebody who has Alzheimer's, and we were going to visit him, and there was a flyer on the elevator talking about the group that you were running at Montefiore. And so I started going there, again, accompanied by a friend, a dear friend who for 2 years or she came every time with me. Um, and then, COVID hit, we went to Zoom. Yeah, that I have to say that was where I found my support group home,
oh, I love
you
that.
know?
I love that it was with us. That
Yeah,
Yet I
yeah.
think it is another one of those things that you anticipate, like, "Okay, I'm probably gonna need help, but right now I've got a task list this big, and it's awkward and strange," and it's the reason I think that people don't always reach out or even try it on. Like I always say, therapy is personal and you have to find your right person. I think support programs are the same. Like, you have to feel like, "This is where I belong," because 'cause they're not all created the same, and they're not all meant to be serving the same
Mhm,
purpose. So yeah, so I'm happy that you're part of our family in the caregiving journey. And let me also add to that, I think when we think of support, a mixed group is, like we have right now, I think is a beautiful thing because there are many people who are 4 steps ahead. There are some coming in just with a first diagnosis. I don't know what we're going to do. I'm just trying to get my feet under me with this. And there are people in the group who have already lost their loved one maybe 10 years ago, so that each person can see, okay, I see that there's hope. I see survival down the path because you're reflecting it back to me, which I think is really, really a powerful thing because the misunderstanding, I think, of support in whatever way people find it is, and I've heard people say, I don't have the capacity to listen to your stories and somebody else's stories and then feel sad about somebody else's stories when I can barely breathe myself. I think until you try this, it's not that. It's about finding
mhm.
yourself in other people's stories so you don't have to feel so isolated. Finding nuggets of how do I do X, Y, and Z can also be in those support areas too. So I hope, if nothing else from today's conversation, people take away the understanding of my 40 years of doing this work, your journey of actually being on this path. We are not meant to do this alone. And
Mhm.
and when we try, that's why caregivers' illnesses, we got the highest rate of, stress and anxiety and depression that translates into physical illness. It's not just a try to power through it. There are consequences to our mental and our physical health if we try to do that. So
Mhm.
I think that is a big important takeaway. I want to just pivot for a second also to
Sure.
something else you said, because you gave me a lot of good nuggets in there. In the field of psychology, we have words for everything, and we talk about something called ambiguous loss, which I think is so applicable to the Alzheimer's journey. And what ambiguous loss is really all about, it's the slow, steady process of grieving at a time when there's no pot roast, there's no get well cards, there's no
Mm-mm.
sympathy
Mm-mm.
cards, there's no thoughts and prayers coming your way. It's you alone grieving a process. And any listener out there who has somebody with this disease knows it isn't like one day you find yourself grieving when they're gone. It is a process of loss all along the journey. And yours has been a 17-year journey. So, talk to me a little bit about some of those losses and maybe some thoughts for people who might be listening saying, yeah, it's been grief in every different form and version that there is.
Yes. Yes. Um, you know, I hear I hear people tell their story, or, I'll be having a conversation with somebody, and I just have my reaction is to feel so sad, and so sad for them, because I know what they're gonna have to carry. And it is. I mean, the thing is it's not like this snapshot, it's gonna be like this, then, fast forward 17 years, and then it's like that. That's not how it works. It's every day or every other day, there is some different reality. And so maybe, for the first couple years, the ability to track a conversation might last a paragraph's worth. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, right? Except it's been creeping, creeping, creeping. You realize that the comprehension at a nanosecond speed. So by the time you have said hello, the hello is gone and the let's is just about disappearing. And so you're in a constant state, or I was in a constant state of recalibrating and recalibrating and recalibrating. Today, the new normal is this. And that might last a month, might last longer, or it might last one day. And then whatever skill was managed today is off the table. Might pop back in for a minute, but it's basically off the table. And you watch, and I think part of the grieving is that you're watching this brilliant, compassionate, connected person disappear, just disappear. So all and you're so you know that, but when you're having dinner and you say, and he's trying to eat peas with a fork, with a knife. I mean, and you're saying you might want to use, well, which one is what's a fork? What do you do with that? What do you do with that? You can't. My response was to grieve to see the vitality of this amazing man leaking out. And anybody who knew him, one of the first things that they would talk about is his compassion. And I remember, and now it's become kind of a family joke, but it was like he couldn't make a compassionate response to something. So the example is, well, I was sick. I had a cold or something. And he was saying, well, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, I got a cold. Well, people get sick. Okay. And then so and so, our good friend died. Well, people die. Who is this person? And so here's where, so that question, who is this person, has to also have compassion in it.
Mhm.
This man cannot help what he's saying. He can't help. So it's not arbitrary. It's not capricious. It's not malicious. It is where his capacity is right now. And so as a caregiver, you were called constantly
Mhm.
to remember that,
Yeah. Yeah.
because sometimes it gets hard.
Oh my gosh. And that hits at a very core spot, I think, for people who are on this journey. And I know myself personally, having been on this journey with my father, that I could have the capacity to say and repeat 100 times. Every time he asked the same question 4 or 5 more times, I really did have the patience and the capacity to address that. When the personality started to change, much in the way you're talking about Dick with that's not a response, that's not at the core of who he is. That I think is one of the more painful parts because we think about Alzheimer's disease and we think about it's a disease of forgetting if you don't know it well enough. Like, okay, so they're going to repeat
Yeah.
in a nanosecond, they're not going to remember that. But it's when the docile person suddenly becomes mean spirited or appears to be disconnected from their compassion or saying and doing things that not in a million years with a healthy brain would they do that. That for a caregiver, and I think I had to say this 1,000 times to my mother, that is the disease talking, that's not dad. Because
Hmm.
again, I mean, for her, they had a very loving, connected relationship that my father would never have even said one small, tiny things in criticism of my mother. And
Hmm.
so when those words were coming out or the criticisms were coming out, it was so hurtful and painful for her that she did have to get back and have to be reminded this is disease talking and not dad. And that brings me to another part of the question, which is
Hmm.
I think for myself and other people, the fear has often been then they pass away. Is there a fear? And was there ever a fear for you after Dick's passing that you would hold on more to those memories of the last 16 years and lose sight of your memories and reminiscing of the largesse of your life together?
I don't think that I had a fear of that.
Okay.
I mean, and let me say that, I mean, we're talking about some of the hard stuff,
Mhm.
but during that 17 years, there were beautiful things and joyful things. Um, so both are true. It didn't particularly, I don't think, lessen the burden, knowing that, or burden, or the experience. But no, I mean, I think that, so we were married 51 years before he passed away. And I don't regret a single year. And I cherish the years before, was that BA before Alzheimer's? But I also cherish the last. Now it's easier to say this because that part of my journey is over. But the truth is that as difficult as it was also a privilege to to accompany him on that journey. It's not one that I would recommend people seek out, you
Right.
know,
Right.
but I think that the other, if we were gonna give a survival tip, is that just as you're adjusting to the new normal every day, recalibrate stuff for yourself as well if you can. And it's easy. It is so easy to lose yourself. I mean, I referenced, seeing myself in my kids' eyes. Um, 'Cause it's little by little. It's a drop here, it's a drop there.
So I just have a couple more quick questions here. There's so much, and I know we could probably talk all day long about this process. And you may have already hinted at this, but for listeners who might just be starting this journey, and I love that you brought in both parts of this, that it is hard and beautiful, complicated and a gift, just all of that wrapped into one, because I think that is part of this caregiving journey and why it's
Mhm.
important that we focus on the caregiver, making sure that they're taking good care of themselves so they can sustain themselves on that journey. But I'm wondering for anybody who's listening, is there something that you would say to them? Like, gosh, I wish I had known this thing that might have helped me along this path. What would that be?
Wow. I don't know, I'm, kind of an advocate sometimes to that ignorance is bliss, you know? Um, even if it's somebody had told me some of what was gonna happen, and you know, my mother and I actually went to I think it was like 6-week program called the Savvy Caregiver. Excellent, and it's available all across the nation, and it has a lot of the nuts and bolts and the science behind Alzheimer's and, the guesses you can try to figure out what stage you're in, I mean, so I did a lot of education in some ways, but I think that what I would have known more is how critical it is to take care of yourself. And even though I thought that I was doing that, and I was doing things I went to, I had the support.
When you reference, there are the practical things that I never want anybody to get caught off guard. So if a diagnosis comes in, you do have to be educated as you were talking about. You have to know legal issues and financial issues and educate yourself about how this disease progresses and how to communicate with your loved one and how to manage behaviors when it's going to be time potentially to make that big hard decision about placement into a facility. I think educating yourself and arming yourself with all of that is really critical. But in between those layers of tasks sits the caregiver who actually has to do those tasks. And that's the part that I think it's almost become this almost a little too trite to just say, let's just take care of ourselves and caregivers need to take care of
Mm-mm,
themselves because it's hard to know what does that look like. Is that a bubble bath? Is that dinner with a friend? And I think that in between can be all of that rolled into one. But mostly I think it's hearing and knowing you're not alone in what you're thinking and feeling because
mhm,
I hear from a lot of caregivers that there's this feeling of like everybody talks about the beautiful, wonderful parts, but I'm sitting over here angry and resentful. Or I'm over here sitting feeling so frustrated and I just lost my temper. And everybody else is saying, what a beautiful gift. I would want them to know it is both and it's not a sprint. It is a long process. It's not like somebody, when we do that comparison with a terminal illness where you can say 6 months to a year, we have no sense of where this takes us on the horizon. Is it
mm-mm,
5 years? Is it 20 years? We just don't know. And that's a sense of feeling so out of control if you're not pacing yourself through this process. So now I know that how we pace ourselves and how we cope can be very person specific. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that you turned to writing and writing poetry specifically as part of your release, part of your coping. Tell the listeners, what was that about? Were you always a poet? Did you always write? Where did this come from? And then would you be willing to give us a little taste of your writing?
Sure. This fits under the desperation category. I mean, I think that I might have said something about recalibrating all the time. And one of my greatest fears was that I was going to resent what I was doing at some point because it's tedious.
Mhm.
It's repetitive. It's all of those things on top of the emotional weight of basically losing your loved one in real time. And there was just this kind of energy building up in me. And so I started taking pen to paper and just letting it come out. And it felt like a download that because I would just start writing and, whatever would come out. And I think that, and the result of that was to, empty out the stuff that the emotions that were building up, uh, the metaphor that if you think about wanting to make yourself by pushing out that emotion, you are creating a hollow reed for yourself. And that then when it's not full of all of these, frustrations and emotion and sadness and all that other stuff, then the love that you have can flow through it. And that's what the poetry did for me. Which doesn't mean I got it right every time. Did I lose my temper? A few times. Mostly I stopped it before it was, but nonetheless, I did not always have fine moments. I didn't. But the poetry helped me have more of those and less of the other.
Mm, I love that. So,
So,
would you read us something?
sure. I picked this one because I think it kind of, in some ways, sort of summarizes everything we've been talking about.
Okay.
So it's called Where Do I Start? Is it that I'm drowning? Is it is that this journey is death by a thousand cuts? Is it that service is the ultimate sacrifice for someone you love? Is it possible to be all these things, to experience all these things? Yes, I think the answer's yes. Adjustments to the new normal that changes so quickly there isn't time to catch up. 2 days ago, catching a handful of Tylenol before chewed, mistaken for candy. Yesterday, explaining that yogurt is edible. Today, explaining sequence. No, you don't go to heaven and then you die. You die and then you go to heaven. Either way, there's no coming back. Placing crumbs in the tunnel of darkness doesn't guarantee you can find your way out or help your beloved find his way out. So, what do? Just sit in the darkness of the tunnel and hope somebody finds you? No. The answer is no. You take your soul's light into that tunnel and hold his soul's light up so it will be there when he needs it at the end of this particular journey.
Wow, what a powerful read. And I know there are many others that you compiled. They were your flowing of love and coping, and as you described it, all compiled into a space for the rest of us to enjoy and learn from and experience. Can you tell us a little bit about the title of the book and where listeners can pick it up?
Sure, I'll show it to you.
Excellent.
Love is an action verb, a caregiver's journey. And you can get it on Amazon or you can order it online from Barnes and Noble or Walmart, wherever you can order things electronically. So it has the poetry, and then it has a series of reflection questions that you can use to journal if you want, or even have a discussion in your givers group. You can use it in that way. Or, well, let me say that's only there if you want to use it. Caregivers have enough stuff to do. They
Mhm.
don't need, it's the purpose of the book is not to give something else for you to do, but maybe find yourself in the pages and know that you're not alone. And that's why I decided to share it.
Well, I speak on behalf of the numerous caregivers out there when I say thank you. Thank you for putting your heart and soul and your beautiful words of your experience to paper, because I think we all benefit from that. So, thank you for such
Thank
a
you.
rich conversation, for being here with us today. I will put information about where to reach you and get copies of your book in the show notes down below. But I just want to say again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with me today. I'm happy we're on this journey together. I hope this conversation gave you something to think about, maybe a moment of pause, a little insight, or something you can carry into your own life. To stay connected, follow Becoming Real. Share it with someone who may also need it. And if you have a minute and you feel kind, please leave a review. It helps more people find the show. And if you want to go deeper than this podcast can take us on these and other topics, consider joining our community where the real conversation continues at the link in the show notes below. Until next time, this is Becoming Real.